Hey everybody, it's Booksy. So today is December 5th. I did not record a video for the weekend on the Friday because I got pretty burned out. Just wanted to take a break and not let my emotions sort of get the best of me. Just didn't really feel it. But here we are on Sunday, and I'm going to bring this to you today. So this is my new hypothesis, and I know that you've been fed a lot of these things, just like I have over the past 11 months plus. And it's very frustrating, very tiring. But I really hope you hear me out today. This is something that, for me, it's been coming to a point ever since I started looking at the fractals. I wanted to know if there was a way, when you see repetitions, to understand like the macro by looking at the micro. And it turns out that there is a way, and it's pretty significant. But I digress. Let's just jump right into it. So basically, this is what my new hypothesis is. Essentially, I believe that there's an upper and a lower limit for each of these algorithmic tests. And the algorithm basically centers on the 0.5 Fibonacci, and then 1 and 0, respectively, are the bottom and the top. I believe that since this stock has first become public, the bottom was 192, the top was 696. And I know that that's going to rub some people the wrong way, but again, I hope you hear me out. I believe this is all one algorithmic play, and we're kind of coming full circle now, finally. And I think that we're going to see hopefully like another leg up. Like I think that's what the next step is. But I also think there's some big implications of this. And here are some of the things that I learned. I will come to this later. But basically this is going to be kind of where we end up today. Let's look at what happened on Friday, because that's where this all started. So basically on Friday, go to the 1 minute. On Friday, what we saw was just ridiculous. We essentially had a iteration repeating, and I've never seen it like this close up before. So I think that was part of the reason why it was so odd, and like alarming to see that happen. But then also, we're in a position where we had already thought that, and I already thought that we were done, like that was the bottom. So this bottom was a bit odd. I did suspect, and I remember, I don't know if I put it in the video on Thursday, I just suspected there would be some kind of a drop. And I thought it would be maybe retesting this region. I didn't think it was going to get down here, but I said, maybe max will retest this. So up until about this point in the day, I was pretty relaxed. I was thinking like, okay, I guess, it went further down than I expected. And again, I'm only looking at this based on what I think the algo is trying to do. And as you know, like that interpretation has changed, because the more we learn and the more that I've failed and hopefully like persevered through that failure, the more informed that we've become. And this right here, this check, ended up looking a lot like the B4, the bottom of the B4, right? The true bottom of the B4. And then that makes me think, well, was I just way off with the rest? And the short answer is I'm not sure yet. I think we're gonna have to wait and see. But there was one thing that I am sure about, and that is that this was a very odd thing that happened on Friday. We saw basically this iteration. This fractal doesn't look immediately the same as this or this, but remember, when we looked at this and examined it, there was a lot of verticality to it. And yeah, I mean, it's the same fractal. All right. And we even got this like mound into a big cell. But then it happened again. So we had this, which I thought, if you look here, I thought this right here was the check. And then it just dipped really low, and it didn't come down as low as this. So I thought, well, maybe it's fine. And then, yeah, sure enough, it mapped 1-to-1. But then when this happened, what I saw was pretty astounding, is that this is essentially the same fractal as this. And I know you're looking at it thinking that's not the same as this, but this is another B4. It's the same thing, and it does the same kind of action into a head and shoulders. into a little t-test, and then there's an R1 and an R2, and so on and so forth, and then it does it again, another B4, and then it's even a smaller one, right? This is very odd. And then it happened again, and I was kind of like dumbfounded. I could not believe it was reiterating that many times. Well, I told our Discord group that I thought that we were still going to hit 33. I said, I think once this thing stops iterating, it's just going to fly. And the response I got was mostly like, yeah, whatever, that's not going to happen. And it didn't happen. But once this thing stopped iterating, right? And this, again, this is like, we count this right here, right? Which I think we should. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 iterations of the exact same thing, of the exact same downward pressure, just pushing and pushing and pushing, getting smaller and smaller and smaller, like a singularity. And then when it let go, it was like launching us. I mean, it was like head and shoulder after head and shoulder, right? I mean, you could just see it. There was one here. There was another one right here. There was another one right here. It was just really symmetrical. This one right here. Okay. And I know you're probably thinking, well, that's just pullback. Like, but no, if you split this in half, you can see them line up. It's kind of disturbing, right? On each of these kind of markers, this one should be like right here. So I just was watching this rip, and I was like, man, they're letting it go really late. There's no way. And sure enough, they didn't make it back to 33. They were trying to get as many of those puts out of the money as possible. So where does that lead me with? Well, I have to go back and just say that on Friday, I was like, you know what? I need to find another fractal. I need to find a fractal that did not look like the one I was looking at originally. Because originally I was looking at an R1. You remember this right here, this large one is an R1. That's my prevailing thought right now. This is an R1. And I thought, well, why did that iterate, right? Why? Okay. And so then I went about looking for why would this have to iterate down so far? I need to find a fractal that helps inform me better of what's going on. And I found this fractal right here. And at first, this might not look like the same, but again, it's an R1, and this R1 is kind of unique in some ways. Oops, did I miss it? So this is the chart that I came up with. This is a fractal of the R1, which is from November 3rd through about the 5th. It really ends right here. And I would say it starts, on this breakout, but I'm really just looking at this region because that region correlates to this. And specifically, I'm looking at this region right here and this region right here, because right here on C, which is just the way that I labeled it, we get a breakdown, and we actually get a repeat of this fractal, which I've called the B4. And all it really is a sell-off. And it happens here as well. It's a sell-off that occurs after the R3 and R4, which are kind of like the final run of the fractal. And then you get the sell-off phase. And that is called the B4. And if you know, I've been tracking on Twitter, I've been looking at this specific B4 in this region over here as it relates to the region that we're in, to try to get some form of comparison to see what's going on and to basically measure the bounce, all right, while we're doing it. But I really wanted to ask the question, okay, why is this happening? So I found a fractal in which is a reaccumulation, okay? So that's all R1 is. It's just a reaccumulation fractal on the way up to, R3, R4. And why it is that in this particular case, that this fractal broke down. It didn't have the typical reverse head and shoulder breakout. Now, what I mean by that is it looks like this, right? But this is actually if you can see it, this is actually the T3, right? This is the T3 fractal. And basically, like, this is kind of what they look like when they break. I'm not going to go through and show you every single R1. I've done that in other videos, but essentially it does look similar to this. But what you would expect to have happen is that basically you create the first part of the shoulder here, and then you would essentially create, in fact, it could have been done here, if it had worked earlier. But the expectation would be that you would basically have this sort of inverse head and shoulder setup. And specifically, it may not come down very far. It wouldn't come down past this, maybe to this green line that you see here, and come up. And this would play as one part of the shoulder. You'd have the head, and then you have another part of the shoulder, and that would be your breakout. That didn't happen. Instead, it went to the B4. So we already know that. So I went ahead and was looking at this as an example. And the difference between this and this, you can obviously see, is the levels at which it went down. This went well below here, whereas in this case, this only went to like 31. This is, again, November. This went to 39.31. This went to 38.9. So in this case, I was not able to say, oh, it had to come down past a previous level or something. It didn't. Now, this did dip into that liquidity zone, which, you know, we're basically in right now, but it did not go through it. So then I looked back and I said, well, why else, you know, would this break down? And I said, well, the kind of the obvious answer is money. I mean, it's volume, right? It's like the desire to build, to get more buy-in, basically. So you put it on sale, you get extra people jumping in, institutions loading up, you get extra shorts jumping in, thinking it's going to fall, so on and so forth. And then you get the momentum that you need, the buying power, right, to help send you up. Okay, so what I was looking at is instead like what value was this originally trying to hit? And that's when I found this, that basically where you have this inverse head and shoulders occur, essentially this is sort of like the breakout, and you could consider it to be the top of T3. It's a simple way of looking at it. It's the top of T3, and this was around 38.74, close to that 38.9 level. I mean, it's really, really close. It's just region right here. And that got me looking back at previous R1s. Every R1 that we have, it's not loading, without fail touches, and I did post about this, I've got some diagrams, but I've checked all the ones that are range bound, and there's 4 of them. 2 occurred here, and then 2 occurred here. All right, there's actually another one in here, but it's super weird. So I'm not counting it. There's another one in here as well. It's not weird, it's just really small. But the 2 major ones in this and the 2 major ones in this, both during the R1 phase, they came back to retouch the top of T3. So that led me to think that perhaps it's that simple, right? And if you look here, the top of T3 would be way back here at like $14, which would be very, very low. So that had me thinking that perhaps there was something else. I don't know, that seems really, really far. And like, would then the expectation have been that during this R1, we only run up to like, I don't know, 30 or something, and we went like double, you know, because then if you had done it there, it may have made more sense, right, to come back and retest this. But that doesn't have to be perfect. And you can see here that I think these numbers were slightly off. And so it's very possible that we were close enough, right, with this, if this is what it's looking for. So I had to do a little more digging. And as I was doing this, I kind of was looking at this timeline here. And I came up with this ratio of like 4 to 2 to 0.7 to 1.5, 4, 2.7, 0.5. It's actually really short. And then assuming it's basically the same, 1.5, that would put the end of this fractal around January 11th. That fractal is just this fractal right here. And this fractal right here, though it may not look very familiar to you, is the same as this fractal, and it is the same as this fractal, both of which were part of the breakouts. So that being said, something else was sort of missing. And I noticed that when I drew this line, this white line here, and this white line, right, which this one is just you could say it's the resistance, like the main resistance. And then this is, of course, your support. The reason I drew this one, if you remember, is on the R1s, I was looking for that pattern, and it plays out right here on this level, right? And of course, this is also where we broke. So I drew this, and when I drew this speed line, I noticed that it seemed to come suspiciously close, like to the top. And that's when I had a thought. So basically, the thought was very simple. Um, Essentially, I had this idea a while back about upper and lower limits and speed lines. And I thought, you know what, maybe it's time to revisit that idea. There's something about this line that was catching my attention. So a while back on AMC, I went about drawing a bunch of speed lines. And the idea here was that the speed lines were pointing to some mythical target. I didn't know what that was about. And basically, this target was something that off in the future, maybe AMC could potentially hit. And I just noticed it because I'm going to actually hide these right here. I noticed it because there was a sort of a trend to essentially show, if you look, if you were to sort of draw speed lines, first of all, speed lines are difficult because they always kind of, to me anyways, they feel a little bit like fake, like you're kind of like making them up as you go, and you don't really know if you're correct because there's so many touch points on any given line. So it's really tough to sort of measure it fairly, I guess you could say. But I was like, all right, well, let me try doing this. I had done a reverse fib fan on ATER and noticed that there was a really strong correlation to speed resistance, right, when you're heading towards a given point. And sure enough, when I did this on AMC, I noticed that, and I did it with a fib fan looking down this way at this region up to here, and it definitely gravitated towards it. And certainly, you can see that as you approach 72, these speed lines kind of accelerate, right? Like it's being sucked into a black hole, if you will. And I was like, that's very peculiar. Well, I sort of put that away out of my mind for a long time because I couldn't find any other evidence that there was some magic number that was an upper limit or some magic number that was a lower limit. And the lower limit number was harder to do because a lot of these speed lines, they end up just kind of going parabolic, right? And they look like they're just going straight down. So that makes it really difficult, right, to sort of find. But that being said, when I saw that other fractal and I noticed the speed lines, a thought occurred to me that I saw those speed lines somewhere else. And the speed lines that I saw were on when I did this. And so that had me thinking that perhaps the best course of action now would be to try and attempt to do speed lines and see where those lead me. So I'm actually going to go to the, I don't think 2 hours too much. I think I'm going to do 30 minutes. And I started looking at speed lines from the region prior to and leading up to the R3. And what I found was very interesting was that sure enough, there are speed lines that run to the R1 as you build up to it, just like there were speed lines that ran to the R1 here, all right, on the other chart I was showing you, that run up to basically this $60 to $70 region. But beyond that, there's actually speed lines, major speed lines. You would just call them trend lines, perhaps, but they're speed lines, right? Like they're going towards an upper limit. And the upper limit is R3 and R4. Now, before you say that that's kind of conjecture, that anybody can do stuff like that. I know that, but the thing is that this makes perfect sense because there was a line here, right? The line was the wedge that everyone was charting. And it would make sense that if the algorithm, when it drops down here into the B4, that it's immediately setting a path for how it's going to navigate this new structure that we don't see as retail, but it's going to create, right? Because remember, it's just iterating. It's going to keep going. And if it has the end in mind, right, which I think it does, and it knows what it wants to do, and I think it does, right? Because you have to understand, like, this right here is this right here, okay? And this is an R1, and this is also an R1. And when this is going on, it's got this in mind, which means that when this is going on, our current situation, it has an R3 and R4 in mind. And that's a big deal. That's a kind of a game changer, in my opinion. And I know it kind of already, like, it's sort of a given when you're looking at stocks that they're going to reverse on certain spots, but I don't often think about them being kind of like pulled towards it, right? That the algorithm is already leading you towards a specific price. And if you're in the context, and let's say, again, like here, we're right here, well, that could be here, right? Or something. What if you're right here in the context of this whole scheme? You don't know what's going on, we're right here. Wouldn't it be beneficial to know where that R3 is supposed to be? So you could make a more educated trade. Because if it had a plan here and it has an upper limit, like it does on these microfractals, then surely it has an upper limit on the lower or on the macrofractal. It has to. So then the question becomes like, well, how do I figure that out? And in the past, I had speculated that the upper and lower limit were some kind of a, I don't know, like, again, mythical number. Like I wasn't going to be able to attain it. And so from there, like, I had to think of, all right, where can I go from this? Because I don't have the upper limit and lower limit here. I don't know what the R3, R4 is. How could I kind of reverse engineer and find it? And of course, you could look at speed lines, and that's my first thought is like, okay, well, I can just start drawing speed lines. And I had done that before and come up with like 160 or close to it. So I was like, well, maybe if I draw speed lines again, and I was thinking about that. And then I was like, you know, if we're in the middle of here, there has to be a reason that R1 has to retest the T3. And I was like, and if this is an upper range, then it would make sense that it might use a Fibonacci sequence to get us there. And I just tried it. I just tried it where this is the upper range. And I thought this is probably the bottom. And yeah, I just tried it out. I'm going to remove the speed lines for now. Okay, we know they're there. And sure enough, I saw that if you have the 1 value on the bottom and the 0 value on the top, that not only does the B4 act as a spring right here, but that the t-test ends up being your bottom. If you make the t-test the bottom, I mean, this ends up being like a spring. But then in addition, something really interesting happens with the T1, the T2, and the T3, which is that you get a really consistent pattern where the T2 basically always tests the 786 region. T3 is set up right below the 618 and breaks it hard whenever you have the R1, and then you sell off and you get the retest on the top of the 618. And all of this is happening, and you can see these levels are being respected as you're moving up towards the R3, right? So if you look at it now, suddenly the algorithm seems pretty darn plain, right? It's got this target in mind way back here. It's going to test these different regions, not always perfectly, okay? But eventually it's going to come down to that 0 value, and then it starts the t-test, right? And then it's off to the races, basically. And I had to test it out, so of course I checked on every single one of our t-tests. And sometimes that 0 value is kind of in a weird spot. But I believe that, at least for now, the way that I've drawn them is correct. And again, it's not like 100%. I mean, the T2 does move above the 786 sometimes, but it respects it. You see that? You know, it has these tests of it, of upper and lower regions between 786 and 618. And then sure enough, the T3 right here, and this is one of those, you know, inverse head and shoulders right here, breaks hard the 618. And often the R1 does come up to this value right here, which is the 236. Doesn't always. It did here and it did here, right? It did in both of these instances. It actually went a little beyond here. As I kept going back, you know, of course I'm not looking for what you would say is confirmation bias, but more so like, my cats are going crazy, that there's some kind of consistency. So again, just mapping like what I'm seeing And yeah, here it is. Like in this case, the T1 sets up pretty low, comes up. It tests all through the 786, 618 regions, but then look at how it goes down. Isn't that weird? So this is funny because this is one of the ones I said was very unusual because the T3 actually sets up lower than the T1, which is kind of strange. And this is why, because it's setting up below the 618. And it's like perfect, right? And here's, here it is again. You get this R1, and then it comes back down and tests this 618. And then it moves on. And this is one of the ones that has a stronger R2. It's a more unique one, and then it runs up to the top value. And again, all the speed lines, you can just draw them all. I don't have to do it for you. This is one that's very stretched out and strange. The values here are bizarre. You can draw it to this. See that little test down here? And it actually works pretty well, but it doesn't make a huge difference. Like, the 618 is still above the T3, so it's kind of just a matter of like how you prefer to draw it. I actually liked it better here because of these. If you look closely, you can see like that it respects this right here. It respects that level, and then it respects this level, and then it goes up further. And it tries to kind of reach the 236, but same deal. It comes back and it retests that region right here. And it occurred to me that more than likely, that's what is going on up here. So I have to just now look and see how to essentially reverse engineer and find the macro version of this. So initially I tested the upper and lower limits of like 72 in here, and it didn't really work out too well. It wasn't awful. All my fibs are gone. Hang on. And as I was moving along, basically, I found that what makes the most sense is if this is a 0 value, and it would be the t-test value, remember? Because if you recall, let's just look at a comparison here. The t-test is a bad one because of that weird downward angle. And sure enough, I tried out some speed lines, and I was like, hey, look at that. You know how this almost ran up like it was going to run? Sure enough, if you do it to the top of this range, you get the same result. You get the Well, what's interesting here is that in this case, I don't think that it initially was going to go that direction. So like if you look at it, and by the way, I'll get to this number in just a second, but if you look at this and you actually charted like these speed lines the way they are, they point to a further date. We'll come right back to that, but I'll get right back to that in a second. But basically what I want to point out is that the reason that I have this number is because I looked at where this T3 was set up to break through the 618. And there's no way to set it up. This is the 786, and then this is the 618. Okay? So this is the 618. And if you put this as the bottom, the only way this breaks the 618 and respects any line is if this is the 786 of the fib. And when I did that, it was like everything clicked. If you look at this region, the way this is tracking right on it, if you look at, and I know that obviously you could draw fib levels anywhere and it probably would track. That's the beauty of fib. But look at where the all-time high is. The all-time high is back here. It's right around $35, $36. And that would be right around this 0.5 range, right in the middle, heading up towards the 328. But it's respected, like it respects these zones really well. And it seems to kind of, like at the beginning of the stock's life, it seems to sort of like not know exactly where it's going to go. And it's almost like, again, there's sort of these two competing directions, right? One is pointing towards some lower limit number, okay? And one is pointing towards some upper limit number. But all the while, all right, we keep in mind that on this fractal, that after you go past this region, the 1, 2, 3, that's really when the next target is set up. And the initial target is not as important anymore. Usually this is the 786 on the initial if it's an uptrend. Like right here, this was the 786 and it turned into, it's basically the same level and it turned into the 1. So then it actually goes up higher, right? Higher high. But yeah, so basically I was looking at this and I was like, okay, and I reverse engineered it, and the target that came up was this odd number of 6096. Before you cry foul and say, no, it's 72, and you could figure it out with an Elliott wave and all this other stuff. Listen, unless you knew this move was coming, there's no way you could have predicted this Elliott wave would be this high, $20. I don't think anybody did. And even if you did, then you would be some kind of a, insider, right? But look at this. Look at where this was respected. Remember when we couldn't break that wall? It was just beating its head against it. And I think because that was the upper limit. Now, you might be thinking, well, what does that mean? If it was the upper limit, if that was where all I'm saying is that's where the R3, R4 target was. And it wasn't supposed to be here, all right? It was supposed to be farther in the future. And I think if you look at these speed lines, like these early speed lines, a lot of them seem to indicate that, this is something that could have been targeted for like October, okay? Or maybe even further out, I'm not going to speculate too much on these. I know that these pointed to this upper region. I showed you that other thing before, right? They already were pointing there. But what's very interesting is that when we get to this point in time, right here, okay, this was COVID, that the speed lines speed up. Something changes in this stock. And I think it has to do with this region right here, where the massive amount of shorting happened. And also, you see how much buying happened. It's like equal parts. All right. And what happens, and what follows, I should say, is that we get this acceleration of the speed lines. And if you start tracking these speed lines, you'll see what I mean. Basically, they start tracking forward. You see that? It's like the algorithm was speeding up because it's not that it couldn't handle the volume. It's that basically, like, as it's approaching, as it's moving through time, the amount of volume that's building on this thing, the amount of momentum that's being built up is pulling this forward in time, the R3, R4 target. So at this point, when this takeoff happens, it has an R3, R4. That's a top range, right? Target of like $60. That's not what happened. We actually blew through it. We almost broke the algo, okay? And so if you're looking at this and you're feeling discouraged, like, don't feel discouraged. The algo accelerates to the high volume and the target comes forward. So not only does this slow, methodical, it's very slow process, all of a sudden just speed up, right? We get the catch, the head and shoulder, all this stuff happens really fast, right? I mean, this is super compressed compared to this region. Not only does it all happen really fast, but the dates push forward. And then look what happens on the T2. The T2 exceeds the 786, right? And it gets knocked back. The hedges are saved because the buy button is removed. Okay, and it immediately just kind of resumes business as usual, except now it has this higher speed line target involved, right? And it's like it's holding back the floodgates, okay, as it's approaching this sort of D date where it has to let it go. It has to release it and let the liquidity fly, okay? It's like it's forcing it, you're forcing its hand. So you have this acceleration, and then this peak right here is really interesting. So when this happens, the question then becomes, well, what happens to the R3, R4? If this is the original R3, R4, right? And we already know the R1 is always going to test the 618, which, by the way, when I did it, came out to that 2447 number. Okay, that's where I caught that from, which actually lines up exactly where. So in case you thought that there wasn't enough data supporting this theory, about how these fractals work. Look at where this 2447 is. I mean, it's 2450 if you want to just say 2450. Maybe I'm a few pennies off. But isn't that incredible? I didn't contrive that. That after I did the thing, I came and looked at this and I was like, holy moly, there it is, right? So there's your 786. Here's your 618, right? And it tested it before it ran, and then it ran, and now it's trying to come back to it, and that's why the algo was iterating. But back to what I was saying before, the R1, what happens now, right? Say, okay, fine, I believe all that, Booksy. I think that you're making a pretty good case here that perhaps this was some upper limit, that the $60 was this upper limit, and these speed lines really show us evidentiary, right? Based on what we've seen, that it has an upper limit, but that it set this upper limit up pretty dramatically, right? At the beginning of all this shorting that occurred. It like adjusted itself really fast to this upper limit. And then as it sped up, as the volume just starts ramping up, and especially here, we move to that faster, right? The floodgates are released. It's like you have a dog on a leash that's trying to get to something, and as you walk closer, it's harder and harder and harder, and then eventually you just let go and it just runs. That's kind of like the way I'm imagining it. It's almost like tension, and they're like purposely like holding it back to meet these certain criteria for tests, right? Well, if that's the case, right, and if this is the T3, and I think it is, and this is the T2, and this is the T1, then this is kind of an anomaly, perhaps. You could argue that it's a lot like what we're dealing with right now, which is what a lot of people are saying, that it's going to dip below the previous supports, right, to get that spring. And I think that's accurate. Like, you could say that. And by the way, this fractal is the aftermath, right, of a B4 fractal, like just like this is. They're all the same. I mean, they always do that. It's not unusual, okay? Like you get the B4, and then you have this section, and then you get your T's into the R1. So it makes sense that since each of these is an R1, that this would be that region. But that being said, I had the question, where do we go from here, right? So this is what everybody wants to know. It's like, okay, well, can you turn this into a predictive model? And the question is, I'm not 100% sure exactly how accurate I could ever be with this thing. I'm not a computer, I'm just a brain, right? And I don't have all the information that an algorithm has, and I can't weigh all of the individual parameters. But I can say that if we're just looking at the general pattern here, the repeated pattern, we're looking at the way that this thing operates on a micro scale within upper and lower limits, and it has them, it sets them up, right? It sets them up all the time. It's probably always shifting a little bit to some degree, right? Then what could we say about an upper limit here? Well, there's only a couple different options. One would be to draw speed lines, and I've done that before and gotten some really crazy targets. Another thing would be to just sort of, consider this, right, this fib sequence again, and consider like, okay, well, can it get any higher? How would we quantify that, if you will? I know that I've already had people suggest to me that I just go ahead and bring this up to 72, and that would kind of help us get there. I don't want to do that. I think this is right. I really do. And I know that may not be very popular, but that's what I think. So the question is, like, where else could we go? Well, I noticed that when we had previously, we had some speed lines that were going to like 160 something. And I was really just looking at them in terms of the future and like trying to sort of figure out if this was back when I was messing around with them before. But I was really concerned, or I was really considering this line right here. This was the big one to me. That line right there was the big one. And so what I did is I looked at that line, and then I looked at another line that happened on the previous run. If you look a lot of these lines will connect like way back in time. But there are some that, are pretty consistent, like attaching this line, which would be like the top of this move, back to like the T2 happens quite a bit, and it works really well. You see that? And it brings you basically to like this 168 number. I noticed that, you can draw these lines in a million different ways, but there's something about that 168 region that just really, like, a lot of these speed lines seem to respect it. You see this? And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think there's something to it. Now, I'm not saying that it's the only possibility, and I already know that a lot of people are going to be like, that's too low. And I'm like, yeah, I think it's possible that if we break out on the R2 and we run past or smack rat dab into it, right, that it's going to reset again. I have no doubt that could happen. No doubt in my mind. Because it's already happened once. Okay? It's already happened once. So I think that basically the upper limit now is something like 168. And again, it's based on the way that I've seen these sort of play out, how they sort of point to the future. Because the t-tests are really, they get pretty steep, right? Like heading up to, you can see why I think this is the t-test. I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? If this weren't here, I think this was more or less like a fluke. I'm not saying that in a mean way, just that I think the algo wasn't prepared for this kind of a buy-in. And then from there, it really changed the course of the stock. But I think it's all about those speed lines, like ramping up to this point. And then, of course, this is being just a general crime. Just criminal activity, nothing to worry about. But yeah, I think that you can make a really strong case for this region right here. That after, basically, as we were approaching this, it was looking for this as the R1. And you can see there are speed lines here that actually will match the R1, but then like broader ones are starting to look at other regions. And this is just the most, to me anyways, it's the most, it makes the most sense to me based on what I'm seeing. I'm not saying it's the only one. And certainly if this thing ran to like 200 plus, I would be very happy. But the truth is that this region right here, 9 times out of 10, is pretty subdued compared to the others. And I don't want to bum people out, but that's just the fact of this thing. When it gets, the R1 is always like the biggest. It just is. There was like one case that I found where the R2 seemed to be bigger, but almost all the time, the R1 is the most significant liquidity test. And you can see it just in the volume, right? So what I'm looking at now is basically just how do I possibly like turn this into like predictive measure, and if the algo wanted to go there, could it get there? How would it get there? And basically, like I'm just finding that there's a lot more to it. I'm not going to get into all that right now in terms of like long term, but I will talk really quickly for about 3 minutes on short term. Okay. Like you spent an hour talking about this stuff and you're only going to tell me for 3 minutes? Like, I don't have to tell you anything. I think people get really entitled, man. They get super mad. Somebody was like yelling at me on Twitter. I was trying to put my kid to bed. And I got really angry. All right. So basically, what I started to look at was the this right here. So this is a fractal of this region. And you might look at it and say, hey, that looks kind of familiar. And I would say, yes, it does. It looks a lot like this, and it looks a lot like this because they're the same fractal. Because I took this fractal over here, broke it apart, and fit it into the box. And I'm not saying it's going to happen this way. This could be very compressed. This could go up really fast, drop back down, go, then rocket. Or it could just, chill and go a little more meandering along, more flat. The reason that I'm looking at it like this with these particular white lines is because I just looked at the only one that I could that had that same trend. Right here where it breaks out and has the R2 is at this line. You see that? And then it retests the top here. So if we were to have a breakout, eventually it would be up here on this white line. Okay, and as soon as we break that white line, I think we're gonna move pretty hard. Now, in this case, there was plenty of volume, but it got knocked down like really hard, and it ended up meandering for a long time. And there are a lot of spikes in liquidity here, folks, but they kept it down. They did not allow it to run. It took a long time. And again, I think it has to do with the map. So I think that the more volume that we get, then the faster this thing will move. 100% I think that. I think if the liquidity is there, it'll accelerate, just like it did over here. It will. I think it will. Like I'm basing that off of what we saw in this region. So it all depends on volume, at the end of the day. And what we're looking at next in terms of patterns, we're looking at a head and shoulder. I know it doesn't look like it here, but that's actually a little head and shoulder, and that's why it goes up and reverses like that. It's always a pretty big push right after the right after the B4, when they finally let it go, right, that final dip, it pushes pretty hard. I would expect the push to be either to this region, this line, which is a fib line. All right. Here, I'm going to try my computer's moving a little slow. Let's finish up. At 3 minutes, it's been 4 minutes. I would expect it to possibly push up to this line at least. That's the $31 range, $31.75 or something. That's the fib level there, and the next fib level is all the way up at 38. If it went up to 38, I would expect a shoulder to probably form here, respecting probably this previous little thing, all right, this little step ladder, or maybe respect this fib level. If we come back down and we can see the t-tests are starting to kind of curl up, we have to get to the t-tests, all right, because there usually is some consolidation that occurs before we get to the t-tests. And I know that you might be saying this fractal looks like this one too, and that's because, again, same fractal, but it's on a tiny time frame. I really used this one over here. I just broke it apart. But you can see after the head and shoulders, we usually get another catch where it consolidates, and then we go down. Sometimes we go down lower, and sometimes we don't. Okay, but if it wants a lower price, that's why I said I think the 24.47 or the 24.50, that will be the lower price if it wants it, and then we would be like off to the races probably. Okay, if the liquidity or if the volume is just super intense, it may have been that this right here is enough. It might be enough. If we see it kind of stay above here, I would expect it to be sooner than later. If it doesn't, if the head and shoulders comes back at any point through that 31, I almost guarantee you we're going to see that 24.50. I almost guarantee it. I would hope that we wouldn't go below it, assuming that everything I'm saying is correct. But that after we hit that, right, we would just be able to move on, and we get the liquidity we need, the volume, I guess, we need, whatever parameters being met. Okay, to move on, the MM lets it go on. I know there's a lot of people who are saying 300 by like Christmas or something. Look, I'm happy with that. If it happens, I will be rejoicing. You have no idea. Okay, I'm glad to be wrong if it means that we're making money, right? But I'm trying to be just as simple, as realistic as possible, basing it on the data that I have, basing it on the way this fractal works. The fact that we did break down in order to have a reaccumulation, it could go very quickly. It could take a little longer. Okay, this particular one that I mapped here was January 11th was when we would finally break this line. That's not super far away, folks. It's like a month away. I know it sounds awful, but we've been through all this crap. To finally break and get back up here to that like 60s zone, I mean, I would be happy with either. So anyways, I hope this was helpful. Y'all have a good one. I will talk to you later.